The radio crackled to life in the command bunker somewhere in the hedgerows of Normandy. The date was July 15, 1944. A German company commander from the 352nd Infantry Division was reporting back to his battalion headquarters. His voice, normally calm and professional, carried an edge of something the listening staff officers had rarely heard from the veteran of the Eastern Front: genuine terror. They know exactly where we are. The moment we move, the moment we fire, the shells arrive. Not in minutes, in seconds. And when they come from everywhere at once. He paused, and in the background, the distinctive whistle of incoming American artillery could be heard, followed by the crackling interruption of the radio signal. When the transmission resumed, his voice was hollow. This is not artillery. This is the finger of God. 3 days later, that same officer was found in an aid station, physically unwounded but classified as a psychiatric casualty. He was one of thousands of German soldiers who would break not under the treads of American tanks, nor from the rifles of American infantry, but from something far more impersonal and yet infinitely more terrifying: the mathematical precision of American artillery doctrine. This poses one of the great paradoxes of the Western Front. The German Wehrmacht, arguably the most tactically proficient army of the Second World War, faced the massive industrial might of the United States across the battlefields of Europe. They encountered American Sherman tanks, which they often destroyed with ease. They faced American infantry, whom they frequently outmaneuvered in the early campaigns. They should have been confident, or at least hopeful. Yet in the private assessments written by German officers, in the desperate after-action reports sent up the chain of command, and in the post-war interrogations conducted by U.S. Army historians, a consistent theme emerges. The German army was being systematically destroyed not by American tactical superiority, but by American artillery. This was not the grudging respect one professional soldier gives another. This was fear. A specific, documented, and pervasive dread of the American artillery arm that stands in stark contrast to their often dismissive attitudes toward other elements of American combat power. To understand this paradox, we must examine 3 interconnected truths. First, why German assessments of American tanks were often contemptuous. Second, why they viewed American infantry as brave but poorly trained. And third, why they considered American artillery to be the most lethal and psychologically devastating weapon system they faced in the West, bar none. The answer lies not in propaganda or post-war myth-making, but in the cold mathematics of fire support coordination, the revolutionary doctrine that transformed American artillery into a weapon of mass destruction, and the horrifying efficiency of a system that turned every square meter of the battlefield into a potential graveyard. The tank that couldn't. To appreciate why German officers feared American shells but not American steel, one must first understand the legend of the Sherman tank, or more accurately, the lack thereof. In the summer of 1944, as American armored divisions poured into France following the breakout from Normandy, German tank commanders were not afraid. In fact, many were eager. The reason was simple: the M4 Sherman medium tank, the backbone of American armored forces, was outgunned, under-armored, and mechanically inferior to nearly every German tank it would face. The numbers tell a grim story. The standard Sherman carried a 75mm gun that could barely penetrate the frontal armor of a German Panther tank at any range, and was completely ineffective against the Tiger I beyond suicidal distances. Meanwhile, the Panther's 75mm high-velocity gun could punch through a Sherman's armor at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. The Tiger's 88mm gun could do so at over 2,000 meters. A captured German tank commander from the 2nd Panzer Division, interrogated after the Battle of Ericourt in September 1944, was asked about his experience fighting American armor. His response was clinical. The Sherman is a mechanical priority target. When we see them, we are happy. 5 Shermans for 1 Panther is not propaganda. It is mathematics. He was referring to an often-quoted ratio that American tankers themselves grimly acknowledged. General Omar Bradley estimated that it took 5 Shermans to destroy 1 German Panther, with the loss of 4 Shermans in the process. Some veteran crews put the ratio even higher. The problem was not American tanker courage or even tactical incompetence. It was simple physics. The Sherman was designed in 1940-41 when the presumed enemy was the German Panzer III and IV. By 1944, it was facing an entirely new generation of German armor that had been forged in the crucible of the Eastern Front. The Americans knew this. They had developed better tanks, the M26 Pershing with its 90mm gun. But bureaucratic inertia and the difficulty of changing production mid-war meant the Pershing arrived in tiny numbers, far too late to matter. German after-action reports from Normandy through the Ardennes are filled with matter-of-fact accounts of destroying multiple Shermans. A report from the 1st SS Panzer Division during the Battle of the Bulge noted, "American armor attacks are unimaginative and frontal. Their tank is vulnerable from all angles. Our crews have regained the confidence lost in Normandy due to air attacks. In tank versus tank combat, we remain superior." This was not empty boasting. During the initial phases of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, German tank units achieved kill ratios against American armor that validated their confidence. At the Schlacht am Krinkeltratrath, a handful of German Panthers and Tigers destroyed dozens of American tanks. The Sherman had virtues. It was reliable, mechanically simple, and produced in overwhelming numbers. But to the German tank commander in his Panther or Tiger, the Sherman was not a source of fear. It was a target. The infantry problem. If American tanks failed to impress the Wehrmacht, American infantry in the early campaigns actively concerned Allied commanders themselves, and the Germans noticed. The United States entered the ground war in Europe in North Africa in November 1942. What followed was a brutal education. At the Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German forces under Erwin Rommel struck inexperienced American units and sent them reeling backward in chaotic retreat. The Americans suffered over 6,000 casualties, lost hundreds of vehicles, and provided the Wehrmacht with a lasting impression. The Americans were wealthy in equipment but poor in skill. A German intelligence assessment from Tunisia, captured later in the campaign, rated American infantry as third class compared to British or French colonial troops. The report noted, "The American soldier shows bravery but lacks battlefield cunning. He is loud in the attack, relies heavily on supporting fires, and becomes confused when his communications are disrupted. He fights best when the battle is simple and the objective clear." This was not entirely unfair. The American Army had expanded from 174,000 men in 1939 to over 8 million by 1944. This explosive growth meant that training was often rushed, leadership was inexperienced, and the replacement system was haphazard. Individual replacements, not trained cohesively with their units, were fed into frontline divisions where they died at horrific rates before learning the basics of survival. In Normandy, Green American divisions struggled. The 90th Infantry Division, in its first weeks of combat, suffered such catastrophic losses and leadership failures that it was nearly disbanded. The 79th Infantry Division took weeks to capture objectives that veteran units might have taken in days. German defenders in Normandy's hedgerows found that American infantry often attacked in predictable patterns, bunched together, and could be pinned down by a single machine gun while the U.S. soldiers waited for artillery or air support to solve the problem. A German paratrooper from the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, captured near St. Lo, provided a tactical assessment during his interrogation. "The Americans do not like to take casualties. If we hold firm and make them bleed, they stop and call for their guns. This gives us time to withdraw to the next position. Man for man, they are not as dangerous as the British or the Russians." By late 1944, American infantry had improved dramatically. Units like the 1st, 4th, and 29th Infantry Divisions were battle-hardened and tactically proficient. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions earned genuine German respect. But the replacement crisis meant that even veteran divisions were constantly absorbing green troops. In the Hurtgen Forest from September to December 1944, American infantry divisions were fed into a meat grinder of bunkers, minefields, and artillery. The Germans, often outnumbered, held their positions because the terrain negated American advantages in mobility and air power. It came down to infantrymen versus infantrymen, and the Americans bled at rates exceeding even the worst days of World War I. The German 275th Infantry Division, defending in the Hurtgen, inflicted losses on the American 28th Infantry Division so severe that the unit had to be withdrawn and completely rebuilt. A German regimental commander wrote, "The Americans are brave, but their tactics are elementary. They attack the same positions repeatedly without imagination. We could predict their movements." So here was the paradox. American tanks were outmatched, American infantry were often outfought, and yet the Germans were losing. Badly. The answer lay not in the direct confrontation of soldier against soldier or tank against tank, but in the invisible grid of map coordinates, radio frequencies, and calculated trajectories that turned the American artillery arm into the most lethal killing system of the Western Front. The mathematics of death. American artillery in World War II was not simply superior in volume, though the numbers were staggering. It was superior in doctrine, in speed of response, and in a revolutionary technique that German gunners could scarcely believe was possible. Time on target, or TOT. To understand why this mattered, one must first understand traditional artillery doctrine. In most armies, including the German Wehrmacht, artillery worked like this. A forward observer would spot a target, call it back to his battery. The battery would calculate firing solutions, load, and fire. The shells would land, the observer would correct, and the battery would fire again. This process, called adjustment fire, was time-consuming. It gave the enemy precious seconds or even minutes to take cover or relocate. The Americans developed something different, something born from their industrial mindset and their obsession with efficiency. The TOT technique worked as follows. Instead of one battery firing and adjusting, multiple batteries across a wide front would receive the same target information simultaneously. Each battery would calculate the exact flight time of their shells to the target. Then, they would fire at precisely staggered times so that all shells, from all batteries, regardless of distance from the target, would arrive at exactly the same second. The effect was apocalyptic. A German position would see no warning. There would be no initial ranging shot, no time to shout a warning. One moment, silence. The next, hundreds of shells from dozens of guns would detonate simultaneously across a grid square, turning earth, concrete, and human bodies into a momentary vision of hell. Colonel Hans von Luck, commander of the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment, 21st Panzer Division, described his first experience with TOT in Normandy. We had experienced Russian artillery at its worst. We thought we knew what firepower meant. Then the Americans showed us a new dimension. There was no warning. The entire area simply erupted. My bunker shook. Men in open positions ceased to exist. When it stopped, we had lost a third of the company in less than 1 minute. The TOT system was made possible by 3 American advantages. First, superior communications. American artillery battalions were equipped with radios that allowed real-time coordination across vast distances. Germans still relied heavily on telephone lines that were cut by shelling or movement. Second, superior fire direction centers. American artillery officers used standardized plotting boards and calculation methods that allowed them to compute firing solutions faster and more accurately than their German counterparts. Third, and most important, an unlimited supply of shells. German batteries were often rationed to 10 or 20 shells per day due to supply shortages. American batteries could fire hundreds of rounds in a single barrage without concern for resupply. But the true revolution was not just technical. It was doctrinal. The American Army developed a system called the Fire Direction Center, FDC, that centralized all artillery assets in a sector. A single forward observer could, with one radio call, bring down not just his assigned battery, but every available gun within range. This included divisional artillery, corps artillery, and even heavy naval guns if they were in range. The Germans called this the Führerwaltz, the fire roller, and they had no answer for it. The battle that proved it. If there was a single moment where the supremacy of American artillery was definitively proven, it was not in a major operation like D-Day or the Battle of the Bulge, but in a relatively obscure engagement in September 1944, the Battle of Aricourt. Here, in the rolling countryside of eastern France, the 4th Armored Division faced off against the 5th Panzer Army in a series of tank battles. On paper, the Germans should have won. They had heavier tanks, better guns, and experienced crews. But they were annihilated. The reason was artillery. The 4th Armored Division had perfected a technique where their tank commanders acted as forward observers. The moment a German tank was spotted, coordinates were radioed back. Within 60 seconds, not the standard 10 or 15 minutes, American artillery would bracket the position. German tanks, caught in the open during approach marches, were destroyed not by Shermans, but by high-explosive shells that disabled tracks, killed commanders caught in open hatches, and forced crews to button up, blinding them. A captured German major from the 113th Panzer Brigade stated in his interrogation, "We never engaged the American tanks on equal terms. Before we could maneuver into firing positions, their artillery had located us. We lost more tanks to artillery than to enemy armor by a ratio of 3-1. This became the pattern across the Western Front. American tanks didn't need to fight fair. They simply needed to spot the Germans and call in the grid coordinates. The artillery would do the rest." The voice of the guns. To the German soldier in his foxhole, the American artillery barrage was the sound of industrial annihilation. It was impersonal, inescapable, and psychologically shattering in a way that tank battles or infantry firefights were not. In direct combat, a soldier had agency. He could shoot back, he could maneuver, he could fight. Against artillery, especially TOT barrages, he could only huddle in his hole and pray that the next shell didn't land directly on top of him. German after-action reports from the Battle of the Bulge repeatedly note the psychological impact. During the initial German offensive, when weather grounded American aircraft and reduced visibility, German units advanced successfully. But when the skies cleared on December 23, 1944, and American observation aircraft returned to the skies, the entire offensive began to collapse. It wasn't the fighter bombers that broke the German spearheads, though they helped. It was the artillery. American forward observers in Piper Cubs would circle over German columns, call in coordinates, and within minutes entire battalions' worth of guns would open fire. Roads became clogged with burning vehicles. German units went to ground and lost all momentum. General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the elite German armored units, described the American breakout from Normandy in July 1944. The artillery fire was unbelievable, more concentrated than anything we had experienced in Russia. My front lines looked like a landscape on the moon, absolutely devoid of any vegetation. At least 70% of my casualties were from artillery, not tanks, not infantry, artillery. The statistics bear this out. Across the European theater, approximately 60 to 70% of all German casualties were caused by artillery and mortars. In some defensive battles, that number exceeded 80%. The system behind the shells. American artillery dominance was not an accident. It was the result of a deliberate, systematic approach to the problem of fire support that began in training and extended through every level of doctrine. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the U.S. Army Artillery School had developed a standardized training program that produced forward observers, fire direction officers, and gun crews with almost mechanical precision. Every officer learned the same methods, used the same terminology, and followed the same procedures. This meant that a forward observer from the 1st Infantry Division could seamlessly call in fire from a Corps artillery battalion he'd never worked with before. The Germans had no equivalent. Their artillery was organized by division, and coordination between divisions was difficult and time-consuming. A German forward observer worked with his assigned battery, and that was the extent of his immediate fire support. The Americans also innovated in ammunition. They developed the proximity fuse, a radar-triggered device that caused shells to detonate at optimal height above the ground, turning every shell into an airburst that showered defenders with shrapnel. The proximity fuse, introduced in the Battle of the Bulge, was so effective that German soldiers began reporting new secret weapons that could find them even in their trenches. A German report from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division in January 1945 noted, "The enemy is employing shells that explode above our positions without striking obstacles. They are devastatingly effective against troops in open or shallow emplacements. Casualties have increased by an estimated 40%. The proximity fuse was one of the best-kept secrets of the war, considered by some historians to be as significant as radar or the atomic bomb in its impact on combat effectiveness. Where the comparison fails, it would be dishonest to suggest that American artillery was flawless or that German artillery was incompetent. The reality was more nuanced. German artillery, particularly the feared 88mm gun used in both anti-tank and anti-aircraft roles, was extraordinarily effective. German gunners were well-trained and experienced. In defensive positions with pre-plotted firing solutions, German artillery could be devastating. But by 1944, the Germans were crippled by three factors that no amount of training could overcome. First, chronic ammunition shortages. German industry could not keep pace with demand, and the transportation network was under constant air attack. Batteries were rationed to a few dozen shells per day, while American batteries could fire unlimited amounts. Second, lack of mobility. German artillery was still largely horse-drawn. Roughly 80% of German army logistics relied on horses, not trucks. This meant German guns could not relocate quickly, making them vulnerable to counter-battery fire once spotted. Third, Allied air superiority. American spotter aircraft and fighter bombers made any German troop concentration a death sentence in daylight. This forced German movement to nighttime only, which slowed response times and tactical flexibility. The Americans, by contrast, had unlimited shells, fully mechanized artillery that could displace in minutes, and complete air superiority that allowed observation aircraft to roam freely. The most compelling evidence of German fear of American artillery comes not from post-war histories, but from the words of the soldiers themselves, recorded in real time. In December 1944, the U.S. First Army captured a German soldier from the 277th Volksgrenadier Division who was carrying a diary. The entries from the preceding weeks paint a picture of mounting psychological collapse. December 10th. The American artillery never stops. Day and night. We cannot sleep, cannot eat in peace. 3 men from my squad are gone. December 14th. More shelling today. Klaus lost his mind and ran. They shot him as a deserter, but I think he was already dead inside from the shells. December 17th. I do not fear the American soldier. I fear his guns. The diary ended there. The soldier was captured when his entire company surrendered en masse after a particularly intense TOT barrage. Post-war interviews conducted by the U.S. Army's Historical Division with captured German officers reveal a consistent theme. Colonel Wilhelm Weibig, Chief of Staff of the ex-LVII Panzer Corps, stated, "The American infantry was well-armed but not exceptional. The American tanks were inferior to ours. But the American artillery was a war-winning weapon. We could not mass our forces for counterattacks because the moment we concentrated, their shells found us. We could not hold defensive positions because they would simply obliterate the entire sector. In the end, we were not outfought. We were outshelled." General der Panzertruppen Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the ex-LVII Panzer Corps during the Battle of the Bulge, was even more direct. "The American artillery was the most dangerous adversary we faced in the West. I would rather have faced 3 Russian rifle divisions than 1 American artillery battalion with unlimited ammunition." By early 1945, the combination of unlimited shells, superior coordination, and technological innovations like the proximity fuse had turned American artillery into a weapon system that the Germans simply could not counter. During the crossing of the Rhine in March 1945, the preparation barrage fired by the 21st Army Group, which included American artillery units, was the largest concentration of firepower in the Western Front. Over 3,000 guns fired more than 65,000 shells in the opening hours. A German officer from the 180th Infantry Division, defending the Rhine, described the scene. "It was not a battle. It was an execution. The world ended in fire. There was nothing we could do. Those who survived did so by chance, not skill." The Wehrmacht had faced the massed artillery of the Red Army on the Eastern Front, and veterans often compared American artillery favorably to the Soviets in terms of accuracy and speed, though the Soviets exceeded even American volumes of fire at key moments. But in the West, the combination of artillery with air superiority and unlimited logistics created a perfect storm that German commanders acknowledged they had no answer for. So we return to the central paradox. The German army met the Americans on the battlefield and found their tanks wanting. They fought American infantry and often found them inexperienced and predictable. But they faced American artillery and knew they were doomed. This was not because German soldiers were cowards. The Wehrmacht fought with incredible tenacity even in the face of certain defeat. It was because they were professionals who understood mathematics. When a German tank commander saw 5 Shermans, he knew he could kill them with proper tactics. When a German infantry officer saw an American rifle company, he knew he could outmaneuver them with veteran troops. But when the shells began to fall in perfect synchronization, when the earth itself became a weapon, there was no tactic, no maneuver, no amount of courage that mattered. There was only the math. And the math said they would lose. An unsigned German report, found in the archives of the 5th Panzer Army after its surrender, perhaps best summarizes the German conclusion. The American army is not the most skilled we have faced, but it is the most lethal. Their artillery has changed warfare. We can no longer concentrate forces without inviting annihilation. We can no longer defend positions without being buried alive. The Americans have industrialized death, and we have no counter. The war is lost not because of their soldiers, but because of their shells. The American artillery system developed in World War II became the template for modern fire support doctrine. The techniques pioneered by the U.S. Army, TOT, centralized fire direction, forward observer integration with maneuver units, are still taught today. The Germans learned the lesson well. After the war, the Bundeswehr, West German Army, adopted American-style artillery doctrine almost wholesale, abandoning their own traditions in favor of the system that had destroyed them. For the German soldier of 1944 to 45, facing the Americans meant facing a choice. Be killed by shells you never saw coming, surrender, or retreat. By the spring of 1945, hundreds of thousands chose surrender. They did so not because they feared American infantry would outfight them in close combat, or because they feared American tanks in a fair duel. They surrendered because they knew that the Americans didn't fight fair. They didn't have to. They had artillery. And in the cold calculus of industrial warfare, that was all they needed.